Hi, this is Margot.
Oh, hi, Margo. Glad that it worked. We're waiting another couple of minutes, and then we'll get started shortly.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. For the ones that have just joined, we're giving folks another couple of minutes. I got some messages saying that people were still jumping on, and then we'll start shortly. As I said, I can mute you, or you can mute yourself. We're going to try to minimize the background noise from the participants, and feel free to raise your flag or just speak at any point if you have a question. All right, great. If you can hear me, and I will assume you are hearing me, thank you very much for joining us today. We have a pretty exciting webinar on some of the challenges and opportunities for impact in the affordable housing space. This is something that came out of, in the spirit of co-creation and co-design, out of some of the conversations that we've had with members of the network, as well as others who have been investing in this space and have been concerned about some of the negative effects that they were seeing through their investments, either in terms of community displacement or gentrification, and also some of the missed opportunities, essentially asking, well, are we really having the impact through our significant investments in affordable housing that we would like to have? And I'm delighted that to go through this conversation today, we have two of the prominent players in this space, Margot Kane from the Calvert Foundation, that will now give us a bit of an overall view of what she has seen through her long tenure there and through Calvert's significant engagement in this space. Latino Community Asset Builders, or NALCAB, that is launching a really interesting fund in this space that is addressing some of the very issues that any point, feel free to ask questions. There is a group chat function on the bottom right. You can ask questions there, or you can also just pipe in. And there is also an individual chat function in case you would like to address somebody directly. And with that, I will pass it on to Margot, and thank you so much. Margot, okay, are you there?
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry, I am here. You faded out, though, so I'm hoping that folks can hear me. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
We can
okay.
now.
Great. Okay. So good morning / afternoon, everyone. I'm Margot. I'm with the Calvert Foundation, and I manage our strategic initiatives work, which touches on a lot of different sectors, including housing, but I have to caveat this, not our housing expert. That is definitely other folks on our team, notably Catherine Gottschalk and Andrew Schlack on our investments team. So if you have hyper-technical questions, please email me. I'll connect you. But I wanted to share some of what we're seeing broadly in the marketplace, and talk a little bit about the structural elements that we weave into our investment approach to meet some of the demands and challenges we see in each market. But backing up a little bit, I think most folks are probably familiar with Calvert Foundation. In case you are not, the biggest point to take away is that we are not actually a foundation. We are an impact investment fund. We raise our money in the retail investment markets using a fixed income product, the community investment note, and we invest that across the globe, actually, for social impact in private debt, primarily debt transactions. And this makes us pretty unique in terms of how we source our capital, as well as our approach to investing it, which is across multiple sectors, across multiple geographies, and generally speaking, we tend to take a fund of funds approach. So why do we invest in housing? And housing is actually one of the oldest components of our portfolio. And it's the first sector where we deviated from our fund of funds model to get into some direct exposures. And that is because from where we sit, which is using social investment to promote and expand social well-being and good, housing is a really critical issue. It is the single largest determinant of intergenerational wealth transfer, of socioeconomic mobility. And this geeky chart I've got up here, what this is really saying is that people are earning money both through their salaries as well as through their capital investments, which are primarily the domain of the super wealthy class globally. But the only element in our global economy that is making a major difference in terms of equality and socioeconomic wealth distribution is actually housing. So it is a critical issue in the United States and globally. And our approach, this is from our website, and we feature actually one of NALCAB's members on our website, which is HomeWise, is threefold. So we invest into affordable housing in the U.S. through balance sheet loans to lending entities that in turn invest directly into property development in multifamily and single family. We invest into loan funds that provide mortgages, residential mortgages, commercial mortgages, pre-development financing, construction financing, permanent financing, cobbling together tax credit deals, kind of the whole gamut of ways in which the existing social investment infrastructure supports investment into housing. We are exposed to that through other funds. We also invest directly into affordable housing developers, and this is where we take an enterprise approach, where we take some of the developers that we think are doing some of the best work in different areas in the United States, because they mostly operate very regionally, and we say, okay, you guys are experts at raising project-specific capital, but what you lack to really expand and operate successfully is enterprise funding, which is unsecured pre-development funding for affordable housing developers. Most of their money has so many bells and whistles, restrictions, and security requirements that they can't lift their head up to think. So this is a product that we developed many years ago. We're one of the only funders that we know of that invest this way directly into developers. And this is a pretty significant chunk of our portfolio. And then finally, we participate directly in affordable housing developments. Mostly this is multifamily. In the olden days, there was a little bit of a secondary market that we also participated in. But post-Great Recession, we do some direct investment in project finance with our kind of our best-in-class lender partners and developer partners. And that includes some of the examples I'm going to talk you through today. So talking about our approach in the housing market, again, from a fairly technical standpoint, I think Noelle is going to speak much more eloquently as to the social impact standpoint, but I'm happy to entertain questions about that as well. But technically in this market, we're seeing a couple of major trends. One is that we are losing, and we are at risk of losing, massive amounts of existing affordable housing stock. This is as tax credit properties are coming up on the end of their compliance period, for example, and they're in major danger of being flipped into market rate condos, luxury developments, et cetera. And then there's what's considered naturally affordable stock, which is also at huge risk in hot markets in terms of speculative redevelopment, luxury redevelopment. I think a recent analysis on the housing market in DC, for example, showed that units that are being developed for the top 5% of earners are being developed twice the rate as the population growth in the 5% earning category, whereas units being developed for the bottom 50% of earners are kind of at half the rate of the population there in DC. So you can have a really unequal development market happening and still have it be considered at a macro level like a healthy real estate market. The other really big challenge is creating new affordable stock. And that is because most public sources of funding have been experiencing and will continue to experience massive, massive cuts in funding at the city level, the state level, regional levels, and even at the federal level. That we still have, low-income housing tax credits, but those tend to only work for the very, very large multifamily projects. The rest of the market's left in the dust. They can also be highly competitive, and they take a long time to pull together. Alone, they cannot address the entirety of the problem in the market. As, for example, the redevelopment agencies in California were dissolved, the entire California market lost an incredibly important resource in terms of the capital stack that pretty much every housing transaction in the multifamily market relied upon to ensure affordability over the last several decades. So that, the ability of developers to create new affordable stock has been really badly hamstrung. And then when we look across the nation at affordable housing developer presence and capacity, there's a lot of coverage gaps, which map in some sense to the historical availability of subsidized funding. And we see major coverage gaps in the U.S. Southeast, the Southwest, and rural areas. And again, I think this is where what NALCAB is working on is really interesting because it will be very much building more capacity in these areas. We see in hot markets, and hot markets meaning, robust real estate markets, we see the lack of the ability to acquire properties in an opportunistic manner being a major contributor to the loss of existing stock and the inability to create affordable stock in attractive areas where there's access to transit, access to employment, healthcare, education. And then finally, we see, and this is a little bit related to the nimble acquisition question, we see developers struggling to braid together all of these different resources that they need to create affordable subsidized housing. And the time it takes to assemble this capital stack will kill a deal, either because the carrying costs will sink it economically, or the window to obtain acquisition financing or permanent financing will expire, and then you've lost the parcel, you've lost the opportunity. So the inefficiency of the capital that is dedicated to affordable housing is in and of itself a major barrier to the marketplace. And then that speaks a little bit to the structural barriers, which include this transition gap, the dangers in transition from acquisition to construction, from construction to permanent, from building residential units and holding them for sale to the sale. At every point in this kind of value chain of transaction around the built environment of housing, you have the opportunity to lose that as an affordable unit, and that's increasing. The pressure of losing that is increasing across the country. In urban markets, development costs are going up and up and up for a number of reasons, and each market is different. But the market is still really skittish on real estate values in the most at-risk areas, places like Detroit and Las Vegas, which are urban and they have high development costs, but your appraised values are not going to validate your project costs. So you cannot obtain commercial capital to develop these properties. And then finally, the concepts of diversity, which in like using the geeky term that we look at in housing, looking at infill development, where you're looking at smaller sites, you're looking at scattered sites, you're looking at things that can be called Class B real estate. These kinds of developments, which are smaller units, smaller multifamily units, or scattered site residential development for sale and home ownership, this is a kind of development which can offset things like rapid gentrification in a neighborhood, rapid real estate appreciation, major displacement, things like San Francisco's situation and the inappropriate use of no-fault evictions, by developing so that there's a diversity of incomes in a given neighborhood. And those projects are the toughest to finance because there are no dedicated or very few dedicated sources of capital that really help those happen. And the economics, especially in an urban environment, are particularly punitive for these kinds of projects. So I'm going to just give two quick examples on things that we've done in response, that we've been a part of, in response to two very different markets that speak to some of these structural issues, Denver and Detroit. So Detroit's a hot market. Detroit has major regional transit expansion with the fast tracks plan over the next several years. And a lot of these tracks are going right through traditionally working class and low-income neighborhoods. Because it's the Wild West, they also do not employ things like inclusionary zoning or dedicate any of that land around the fast track expansion to maintenance of or creation of affordable housing, workforce housing, and et cetera. So for-profit developers, speculative developers can buy up that property and flip it for luxury housing. Major demographic shift. They have huge population inflows coming in, largely young people, largely single people, which has its own implications for the development of a family-friendly market. And there's a commercial real estate boom because of the marijuana laws, which I thought was fascinating. Fascinating unintended consequence. Warehouse real estate in Detroit, Denver, and specifically along the rail lines, which is where a lot of their undervalued commercial real estate used to be, has gone from, let's say, $30 a square foot to $90 a square foot once growing marijuana became legal, because that's really valuable for that particular industry. So that's putting pressure on the market. And what all of this means, basically, is the incredible amount of for-profit and speculative development in Denver is not only going to displace people, but it is also going to prevent working class and low-income people from benefiting from the growth and the development in Detroit. So we partnered with the Urban Land Conservancy, which is a local affordable developer, to create a nimble acquisition fund, because what they're looking at is they're up against developers with very deep pockets. They're up against people who can plunk down $4 million in cash tomorrow, no questions asked, no contingencies, right? And they're going to flip this to Lux condos in a year and make an incredible amount of money off of it. What Urban Land Conservancy does is they work with the local communities to help the communities identify facilities and services that they would most like to either maintain or create in the neighborhood, things like Boys and Girls Clubs, things like charter schools and health centers, and including affordable housing. And so we created this $10 million line with them that allows them, because of the structure of the line, to move very quickly when properties become available in these target communities, these low-income communities, with streamlined draw approval, multiple draws allowed, large concentrations allowed. It enables them to develop properties kind of gradually and with community input because the cost of capital is very low, so it enables low carrying costs. They're not squeezed into selling to for-profit because of cash flow issues. And this also has a longer tenor than most typical acquisition lines and is only partially secured. So it allows for patient redevelopment. It allows for developing it to the right place and positioning it really well for refinancing in potentially up to 7 years. It's also not limited to housing, and this is because the Urban Land Conservancy already has a structured fund that it is managing that has many, many wonderful things about it that is targeting the same communities, but it only allows for housing development. And what they realized was that there's all of these great parcels around their housing developments that are being ignored, and they can't do anything about them. And one of them is on this slide, which is a low-income, it's in a low-income area. It's an office building that mostly houses nonprofits that provide services to recent immigrants and refugees, of which Denver has a growing population. And the original plan for this building was a for-profit developer was going to purchase it and flip it to market rate condos. And this would have displaced the 130 people who work there, who serve over 1,000 people a week from local refugee and immigrant communities, all of whom use pretty much public transportation to reach this space. And chances are they would have been pushed out to the fringes of Denver and would have lost the ability to serve this clientele. The other example is housing, and this is the Woodward Corridor Investment Fund in Detroit. This is something that is the brainchild of Kresge Foundation, and specifically Kimberly Cornett at the Kresge Foundation, and identified, again, very, very much rooted in place, a specific set of problems in Midtown Detroit, including the cost of development far outstrip appraised values, that there's a real lack of workforce housing. There's a ton of anchor institutions in Midtown Detroit, Wayne State, the Henry Ford Medical Center, and their employees were all living elsewhere. So Detroit was not benefiting from the presence of those people as taxpayers, as retail customers, as they were providing a lot of kind of larger infrastructure investments that were putting in ground floor retail, but they had no customers. And generally, it's Detroit. So there was a lot of, there's a lot of traditional investors that are not going to take the risk of Detroit, even in a corridor that is under kind of a deliberate revitalization plan. So they did a very in-depth market survey and created this $30 million fund that works to address some of the very specific needs in Detroit. It's focused on infill sites, the smaller scale multifamily sites that are presently largely abandoned or blighted. So they're mostly abandoned lots along this corridor, so they're fighting urban blight as well. It's a 15-year tenor, which is incredibly long-term for a fund like this, but it really allows for that much slower real estate appreciation, reduces your refinance risk, reduces the pressure on the property owners. It provides a streamlined source of construction financing with permanent takeout to developers who, as we talked about before, lose a lot of projects in that transition gap. And probably one of the biggest differences here is the really high loan-to-value tolerance, which is very Detroit-specific, where we know for a fact that the cost of the project is going to be over 100% of the appraised value of the land. And we're taking that risk anyway because we believe that this area is going to be worth it, and investing in diverse set of incomes in this area is going to be worth it. Now, there are a number, and in fact, probably sufficient affordable housing units in this area. And the danger was this, the threat of concentration, which is where the only people who live here are people who are on Section 8 housing, which makes it a very difficult neighborhood to diversify and develop. That just closed earlier this year. And the last thing I'll talk about is just our growing recognition that you cannot address housing in a vacuum. Housing is a major social determinant of health. So where you live, and this is where I live, Washington, D.C., can determine your life outcomes as much, if not more, than your genetics or your behavior. And there's some really stunning inequalities in terms of how much a zip code can determine your lifespan. As well as children's attention and attendance at school, chronic disease management, adult workforce employment, et cetera. So to address this, we're looking at a housing-based intervention, and this is what I call a spaghetti monster diagram. I'm sorry to inflict it upon all of you. But it's a pay-for-success model, a social impact bond, where we're testing whether housing interventions, namely interventions that green the home can lower chronic incidence of severe asthma for low-income children in a particular population in Baltimore. We're working with the Green Healthy Homes Initiative and Johns Hopkins, as well as a couple of local foundations and evaluator and actuarial to figure out if this is going to work. And this is a really complicated structure, and it's complicated because what we're trying to test is frankly complicated. And this is what it looks like when you move from, all right, we can measure units and we can measure the built environment, and we know who's living in the units that we build, and we know their income levels, et cetera, and does building these units make a difference on the quality of someone's life? And that's what we're trying to test here. And I'll let you guys know how it goes in a year or so. Just throw up here some other examples, really interesting examples that are coming together. You have other funds that are, again, very locally focused, like the Bay Area Transit-Oriented Development Fund, which was developed in part, at least, to the dissolution of the RDAs in California. You have Rock USA, who's a former webinar presenter here, again, targeting a very specific need amongst an identified population. You have a Housing Partnership Equity Trust, which is a really innovative new REIT managed by the Housing Partnership Network that's focused on the naturally affordable stock and Class B real estate. So really targeting what we would consider the missing middle in the affordable housing market. And then you have SUN, LLC, which we're an investor in as well, managed by Boston Community Capital, that is very much focused on foreclosure prevention amongst single-family neighborhoods in low-income areas in Boston, and actually they've been expanding to Maryland as well because the model's been so successful. And then finally, there's a lot of interesting work in places like Detroit and Atlanta, too, around how you use land banks and land conservation trusts to ensure permanent affordability. And this is also where shared equity models come in residential markets, and specifically in home ownership markets, which is an interesting development, and there's some very hairy ethical issues that you can get into there, which we won't get into right now unless you guys really want to. But in general, I think we're in a new normal ever since 2009, and everybody is still scrambling to figure out what works, and everybody in the housing market is operating with less resources and more negative pressure to achieve the goals they want to achieve because of the lack of public funding, because of the rapid increase in urban real estate markets, and frankly because the populations that we're targeting, low-income populations, vulnerable populations, have not recovered from the Great Recession. They are worse off, and social equality and wealth is a bigger problem now than it was 20 years ago. So all of those mean that housing is a really important area to focus on right now. And with that, I'll pass it over to Andrea, if you want to do questions, or directly to Noel.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret. That was super helpful and super interesting. Yes, I think there will definitely be some questions from the participants. Please feel free to kick off with something before we turn it over to Noel for his side of the presentation. And let me know if you need me to take you off mute.
Margaret, this is Morgan from Thai Investments, and super exciting, both kind of conceptually and then the specific projects that you're working on. So two questions I had. One very practical of, are some of these still open to co-investors, or these sort of things at this point that Calvert is kind of leading and running with Kresge and others? And then the other that I was curious about, you mentioned kind of early in the presentation something about housing being shown as kind of you either said the primary or the only pathway towards increasing assets for low-income families. And I wanted to ask about the role of business ownership, if therefore that got discredited, and I know that may be different in like a co-op environment versus other ESOP or other types of environments. But yeah, just was really curious about that data.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the co-investor question, which is a great one. And this is, technically, I think the Denver facility, which we own and operate with Urban Land Conservancy, that is open to co-investors who can target it who can invest it in a number of different ways, either through our own Ours to Own initiative in Denver, so directly through Calvert Foundation's own balance sheet. We also have a number of foundations and family offices participating in this facility, and it's ongoing. So that, we're still raising money for that of different sorts. And then the Woodward Quarter Investment Fund did have a full close at its present level. I think if people are very interested in it, I'm happy to make a connection to Capital Impact Partners, who's the fund manager. I think what they wouldn't want to raise probably is more of the senior debt in that fund, which is right now largely Prudential and MetLife. But there is mezzanine that we're invested in. That's where Calvert Foundation comes in. And there's Kresge Foundation in there, and also Capital Impact Partners has their own money in there. So I think they'd be willing to bring more investors into the mezzanine tranche. But in general, these kinds of opportunities don't come packaged, with the exception of the Housing Partnership REIT, the equity trust. And this was part of the value proposition of that equity trust, was to say it's painful, right? It's painful brain damage for most impact investors, even sophisticated ones, to do these investments. You're either doing it on a project-by-project basis, or you're creating these really complicated structured funds that they always take at least twice as long as you think they're going to take to even be developed. And then once you've developed them, the pipeline you use to inform the structure and the development has moved on, because it's 2 years later and the markets have shifted, and then you're kind of stuck. So there's, I'm cognizant of the challenges of investing in this market, which is rather opaque. It's not very well integrated into the broader impact investment world, even, with the exception of low-income housing tax credit markets, which is a whole other ballgame. And there aren't really frictionless ways to invest easily in this, especially since the secondary markets failed, because there were some really well-done affordable housing mortgage-backed securities that were issued by entities like Self-Help and the Community Reinvestment Fund that we invested in, that now, they're dead on arrival. You can't do that sort of thing anymore in the market. So investable opportunities do carry a lot of brain damage. And thinking very carefully about how you approach a structured fund is really important from an investor standpoint. And that's maybe a topic of another webinar. We're learning a lot of lessons in that arena right now. And on the home ownership question versus business ownership. So this chart I pulled is very, very macro. And I like it for a couple of reasons. To answer your question, I think you have to go down a couple of levels. So away from the rarefied MIT economist sphere and interregional markets in terms of what constitutes the biggest boost to economic mobility amongst different populations. And I think you'll find diversity depending on a lot of things, such as immigrant status. Traditionally, first-generation immigrant populations of certain populations have used, majority business ownership as a major method of social mobility, versus in low-income communities that have had, many generations and a history of being lower earners, of being in the low-income scale of the population. How home ownership is the primary way that they or their families access the resources to move amongst economic brackets or wealth brackets, and that is because of real estate appreciation, population growth, and urbanization. So that's kind of the flip side of what we would consider gentrification. And there's a lot around that. But my answer is it really depends. But we know for populations like African Americans in PG County, that home ownership was one of the biggest growth factors in the growth of the middle class in that population. And it is also one of the biggest risk factors when the subprime mortgage bubble began, because those populations were targeted and equity was stripped from those households at a rate that far exceeds that among white households. And now those populations are more vulnerable because of home ownership. So it gets very complicated.
Right. One quick follow-up, Margot, on your comment about some of the difficulties in structuring this sort of deals. What are the recommendations for the investors who are as thoughtful as you are in this space, but don't quite have the ability or the opportunity to dive as deeply into these structures?
Good question. And you reminded me I have another slide. So on our investment considerations. So, I mean, the easiest advice in a bag that I can give you is partner with someone who knows what they're doing. That's number one. Ask them what kind of capital they need in the market, or that their members need in the market. You know, develop faith and trust in the quality of the work that they're doing. Ensure they have the capacity to do what they say they're going to do. And then try to structure money that is responsive to their needs. So don't start at a place with, well, this is the kind of money I have, so this is what I'm going to push out into the market. Or this is the kind of outcomes I want to see, so this is what I'm going to put on my money as it moves out into the market. Because you're an investor and you have to react to what is there. It's a fundamentally sort of like reactive capacity in a lot of ways. And I would recommend listening. Find the people that you trust, whose work you admire, who seem like they know what they're doing. And you've got one of them on the call today, not me, but Noel. And ask them, you know, so if I were to invest in you or in your markets, what would work for you and why? And try to make it work from there. That's actually our approach. And we are highly sophisticated. And we have a lot of the tools and infrastructure that other investors don't have. But without that listening piece, it will not be as successful, kind of regardless of your internal capacity. But here are some of the considerations once you have, let's say, identified a market, identified a couple of potential developers or lenders or structured funds or products that you want to invest in. Big things, especially in the housing market, that you want to be very educated on is what is this partner's access to market insight and intelligence, because this is the oil that greases the wheel in the housing market. Another one I always like to ask is, what's your additionality in the market? Is there competition of trying to do the exact same thing, and then just putting more of this money isn't really that helpful? The developer capacity, I think, I've talked quite a bit about this already, but the developer capacity is also fundamentally related to the networks they maintain, whether those networks are at a local scale or a regional scale or a national scale is going to determine the kind of investment opportunities you're going to see. So that's an incredibly important element, and ties directly into the pipeline question. And then proximity, liquidity, and complexity. We could talk a long time about those. Complexity, I was thinking about, the structured fund challenge, for example, placing a lot of contingencies around draws for acquisition, for example. All of these things represent structural barriers. And then consider who your co-investors are. The more co-investors you have in something, whether you're pulling together a structured fund or participating in one, the longer it will take to close and the more complex it will be. It's just a fact. It may still work out really, really well, but it will be harder. But it offsets the second piece, which is permanent. If you want this to last for a long time, I mean, there's a big difference between setting up a fund with 5 years, 5-year term and, 2 investors. And then after we are done, we're exiting this market because our strategy is changing and creating something that's going to have lasting impact and institutional implications and local presence, like work that Kresge is doing in Detroit. Because what these markets need are long-term players, long-term capital. They don't need transitory capital. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Sorry, my computer, I have a bit of a bad connection. It takes a while to get off mute. That was terrific. If there are not burning questions, I would say let's turn it over to Noel, and we'll see how his fund is addressing some of the concerns that Margot shared with us. But just a quick opportunity, yeah, if anybody has a couple of comments before we turn it over to Noel, or there will be time for questions at the end of his presentation as well. All right, great. Noel, thank you again to Margot for this terrific setup of the issues and how Calvert is going about it. Noel, I'll turn it over to you, and really look forward to hearing this. Thanks.
Making loud, affirming remarks. That last slide in particular resonates with a lot of thinking that we've done. So my goal here is to take about 15 minutes to orient you to a fund that we've structured with all the challenges that Margot talked about, and try and use this as a way of talking about what we were responding to and how we were trying to do something a little bit different to do exactly what Margot said, which is to listen to who is actually deploying this money, and how do we create a capital facility that really connects with what they are doing and makes financial sense and has a clear case about social impact. And so the opportunity to do this, JP Morgan Chase Foundation and the Ford Foundation have both sort of invested in our work over the past year to give us the opportunity to sort of think this through and structure something. Just a quick introduction to NALCAB. We're a national 501c3 membership organization. We've got organizations working in 33 states, more than 100 groups. And our focus is on building assets in Latino families or communities and organizations. And essentially, we focus on 3 areas: equitable neighborhood development, small business investment, and consumer financial capability, which for the people we work with could also be called immigrant economic integration. And I hope to, by the end, connect you to how a housing strategy actually connects to all of those things. So, I mean, we think of ourselves as connecting communities with capital. That's most fundamentally what we're trying to do. Since 2008, we've connected groups with about $260 million in investment. That has been through a unique moment, right, through responding to the recession, taking advantage of stimulus funding. And in fact, a big chunk of that money came from a very large grant from U.S. HUD for the acquisition rehab of foreclosed and vacant properties. And the reason I focus on that is because it is that experience over the past almost 6 years that led us to ask this question about how could we structure a fund to continue this work. This was the largest federal grant ever made to Latino communities through a nonprofit network. And $137 million. And when we look at the impacts of that, we've now deployed using that money and then the churn of it, right? So you acquire a unit, you rehab it, you sell it. That sales proceed comes back and you redeploy it. So $215 million in direct investments, that's unleveraged, and about 2,000 affordable housing opportunities. But when you get down to the impact on community, these are critical issues. Job creation during this period in these markets and in the construction sector was enormously responsive to what these communities needed. We heard story after story about contractors who said, if I did not have this contract, I would have gone under. But we were able to, in this case, leverage federal dollars to keep a churn going in these communities. And then, $50 million plus invested in local small businesses. And so I'm beginning to get to the question of how is it that working with these local developers through a network actually begins to really reinforce your social impact as well as your responsiveness to the local market and ultimately, your fiduciary responsibility. This is just in January, the president's standing in front of some of the work we did under this grant. And, it does take some due diligence to get the president in front of your work. So if I think about what are the keys to success of that whole process was, the members brought market intelligence. They were sourcing deals. They were out there finding things that there's no way we could have found from a national perspective. Development capacity. These organizations, by and large, have been around between, 20 and 45 years working in their communities. And have very established local relationships, so they're able to leverage in municipal investment and talk with community groups about what needs to happen. So that local presence is enormously important. NALCAB ensured network cohesion, effective asset management, leverage additional dollars, and in effect, we could have never accessed this money individually. Together, we could. And that aggregation effect is very, very important, whether we're talking about private money or government dollars. And the developers, obviously allowed a multi-market impact and some significant scale. But all that being said, we went through this process, deployed $215 million. We're still in an ongoing crisis. Margot said it very, very clearly and eloquently. The communities that we focus on are still in a position of having been disproportionately impacted by the recession. And so we've got lost wealth, housing instability, compromised credit, right? And so housing is a key part of the response. In a silo, it is not enough. But when you think about the wraparound effect of what these local developers can do, housing is a really key component. And we know that stability in housing is connected to all kinds of outcomes around children's education and access to employment and all these sorts of things. And so the developer network, again, becomes a really important piece of what we're talking about. And Margot also pointed out the changing marketplace. So public investment in affordable housing is going down by and large. Real estate values and construction costs are going up, which creates a squeeze. And so if your strategy for production relies on federal subsidy, it is a declining strategy. That's the bottom line. And we've seen that for some years coming. And so our challenge then was to create a pipeline to connect private capital to these same networks. And it's very, very important, I think, to distinguish in your mind sort of a lot of the examples of what's been going on in this field is focused on larger transactions, multifamily on the East and West Coast. What we're talking about in these markets is single-family subdivisions, single-family portfolios in concentrated areas, small multifamily. These are fundamentally different transactions in terms of how complicated they are, how many investors you need, and how long it takes to do them. And so aiming at that specific market, we have proposed we're putting together a fund. And our goal is to strengthen underserved and distressed communities, so a place-based thinking, by creating affordable housing opportunities that open a path to economic opportunity for low-income and minority individuals, a people-focused social impact. Our investment strategy is to invest in the acquisition and total development costs of single-family and small multifamily projects in order to serve households over a range of incomes and produce a financial return. So this is not 100% affordable. We want to create a range so that we are actually getting the federal subsidy out of the development process. We want to structure it in the takeout, right? But by getting it out of the development process, you're bringing down the cost of development and the timelines of development very significantly, and it's one factor that does that. So our acquisition strategy is to source potential deals from the NALCAB network, which we've been working with this network for over a decade. We've been working in very close contractual relationship with this NSP deployment for the past 5.5 years. So it's a very well-oiled machine in that sense. The acquisition strategy is aimed at producing or preserving, because both are incredibly important aspects of tapping the marketplace, affordable housing that creates access to employment, education, and health resources. I cannot overstate how important it was for Margot to touch on this issue of the social determinants of health. Also, the Urban Institute and MacArthur, actually just a couple of weeks ago, did a convening at the MacArthur Foundation focused on sort of how is housing critical in economic mobility. So these connections sort of across concepts and fields are very, very important in terms of it makes a difference where you site the project. So in the acquisition strategy, that's very much what we're thinking about. And the funds will not leverage commercial debt at the local level. So when the fund goes in to acquire a property in a local LLC that we set up, we're not looking to leverage commercial debt there. And I'll get more into why we think about that trade-off, less leverage, but in fact, much more control over our capacity to have social impact and to make hard decisions about when do you balance social impact and financial return. The implementation strategy, the local LLC that the fund controls will contract with the NALCAB network developer for development, management, broker, homebuyer counseling services, and in fact other services they can bring to bear. And so we have well-tested organizations in the local markets and other markets that are doing this work. And then NALCAB does the asset management, the overall fund management, similar to the NSP consortium structure. And then in disposition, we're seeking to sell single-family units to well-prepared homebuyers. So a portion of this portfolio, the larger portion of the portfolio would be single-family, and the smaller portion would be small multifamily. So we want to, where we can get well-prepared homebuyers, and in some cases that may involve a rental hold for some time. So you go and you pick up a portfolio that's already rented, for example. We've been looking at one in Nevada, actually, where investors are looking to dump this. What you would expect to happen is that the sort of highest, the way to get the most money out of it is to grab that portfolio, dump all the people, and sell it immediately. And in fact, there's this great opportunity to go in and grab that portfolio and hold it and provide services to the people who live there so that half of them get sold to people in place, right? That kind of thinking. Then the developers will have the first right of refusal to purchase the rental unit. So what is your takeout for rental? We want our nonprofits to have the time to go assemble the capital to do a permanent takeout strategy in the term. And then we're aiming at long-term affordability and avoiding involuntary displacement of low-income people. It's a strategy that I think can be used in what I might call warming markets. We are not aiming at San Francisco and Boston and New York with this. It won't work. The numbers don't work. But when you start looking at places like San Antonio, Texas, you start looking at places like Pilsen in Chicago. These are markets that still, they're heating up, but you still have the opportunity to go in and do these things, and the numbers are not quite so upside down. And then certainly places like South Texas or rural Colorado. And so some differentiators here in terms of our thinking is that there aren't that many private capital sources that are focused at producing affordable single-family and small multifamily in a mixed income portfolio. We are looking to drive capital into markets that are not currently well served by impact investing. And when I say markets, what I mean is both geographically and ethnically. So we're talking about Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Illinois, Missouri, very southwest, midwest part of the country, and much more heavily Latino. This tracks on where the recession hit hardest. And this is where our network has the strongest capacity to deploy capital in these sorts of effective ways. And so a strong connection to the developer network, therefore, is probably the biggest differentiator, right, and the biggest competitive advantage that we have here. As I said, targeting Latino communities through Latino-led institutions. And so I want to just run through how we're thinking about social impact. So you can really get into the housing finance of this stuff, and I find it very interesting, and I really enjoy it. But why are we doing this? So the impact on people, these questions of stability and access are at the center of our thinking. There is really very little debate about. In the 90s, you heard a lot of characterization about, being a homeowner makes your children's brains grow, basically, right? Well, I mean, I think more sophisticated research has shown so does rent control. So does staying in the same place regardless of the ownership mechanism over a stable period of time. And then this access to employment, education, and healthcare, and that has to do with where you locate your acquisition, what the access to transportation is, and what services you can bring to bear for people. These are issues that change people's lives, that make them, and I think MacArthur is now arguing with Urban a lot more and more, they're a key to economic mobility. And then the impact on place. one thing that is enormously difficult to do is to say, what's a strategy that's going to prevent gentrification or that's going to be right for this market? Well, the only way you know that is by being in the market and studying and understanding it. And we've got that baked in with the developer network. And so we also think very much about, not just the economics of it, but the culture of it. We think about gentrification not simply as a price pressure on families and individuals, but actually as an impact on the culture of a place. And I think the most dramatic example of that we studied very closely is in the Mission District in San Francisco. But this, that's a very dramatic example. But we see this happening, particularly as the markets appreciate in places all over the country. And so the factors that we think help support social impact in this model, certainly the nonprofit developer network allows for local hiring and contracting, and we've sort of proven that with the NSP investment. Our contractor networks don't look like private developer contractor networks in many cases. Services for residents, being able to bring to bear homebuyer counseling, workforce development services, and then leveraging subsidy to enhance affordability. The relationship with the local municipality and the state becomes increasingly important in a very scarce environment of subsidy. And the fact that we've got trusted brands that municipalities are willing to work with to maintain long-term affordability, for example, in the small multifamily portfolio that we're picking up, is very important. We'll have a charitable oversight committee. So yes, overall you're saying you're doing these things, but on a transaction basis, how are you ensuring your focus on social impact? The charitable oversight committee does that. And then we get back to no commercial leverage. We want to be in control to make real decisions, right? We are responding to local market conditions and very specific situations. And so the moment that we've brought in 70% leverage, we have signed over some of that capability to make those decisions. And so the other thing that this does is that Margot identified, I think, a very important thing with the transition gaps between sort of pre-development and construction, permanent financing. That's why we want to go out and take down a whole deal and take it all the way through, right? Because there's a lot of that transition gap and a lot of getting commercial leverage in and out that in fact does create higher costs, slows the deal down, and becomes, as Margot said, a structural barrier. Just to give you a sense of how we're thinking about the affordability range, we're thinking about a minimum of 40% is in the traditional low income, 80% of AMI and below, 75% in the moderate incomes, 100% of area median income and below, and then some higher income, which helps us create return, going up no higher than 150% of AMI. One of the things that's very nice about sort of taking on smaller deals, single-family portfolios, small multifamily, is that we can make some decisions about what we do from deal to deal, as opposed to sort of we're having to create a big structure deal for a single building, right? And in all of our modeling, we're achieving sort of better outcomes here. And the goal here is that this is the affordability range while the fund is holding it, right? And our hope then is that at takeout, the nonprofits have been able to structure takeout financing that brings this level of affordability even deeper, right? And that's thinking out over the 5-year term. And finally, these issues of family stability and access, I talked a little bit about it. Connection to services, the location, service, and transit orientation. I'll just say that the issue of who does the deal makes a difference. Community control impacts local investment. And I know I've said it a couple times now, but I can't tell you how different deals look when a private developer does it versus when one of our members does it. And giving them the capital to go out and look a lot more like a private developer in their speed, their ability to do the transaction, I think will be really transformative in some of these markets. So we're raising $25 million through sale of both equity and low-cost debt. The PRI debt allows us to mix down the cost of capital, but the equity structure allows us to have the capital in the deal in a way that is patient and doesn't force us to try and squeeze out sort of as much as possible in order to meet immediate debt payments. 5 years is the term, and again, this would be sort of crazy for large multifamily, but it makes a lot of sense for single family and small multifamily. This is the kind of time it takes to get a deal done. If you're selling them, you can actually sort of churn here a little bit. You can do a couple of homes with the same money, and if it's small multifamily, you have a rental hold, and you've got, the nonprofit developers are trying to so often assemble capital at a very quickly moving, aimed at a very quickly moving asset. And the hotter the market is, the more quickly moving that asset is. And if we can grab that asset and have it work in a financial structure and be able to hold it for 4 years, 5 years, I am very, very confident of our ability then to structure a final takeout by the nonprofits that have been doing this for a long time, right? So we only work with developers to do deals that they have done and have a real track record of doing. And let me wrap up here, just a couple of other points. We have a significant investment from the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, which allows us to put in $2.6 million of our own equity. And so that's sort of seed capital in the deal that we already have in hand. And that capital, or at least a portion of that capital, will be used to provide a 5% loss protection to investors. It won't guarantee return, but it will protect against actual loss. And we've tried to do a structure that matches the needs. The listening. I was, in fact, cheering when Margot said that. The equity PRI hybrid, and I talked about a couple of these things along the way, so I won't belabor the point, but the 5-year term, it matches what we're trying to do here, and the connection to the developer network. Just a word on the capital deployment. It looks like sort of deals that are about $1.5 to $4 million tranches, 7 to 10 individual deals. This is a proof of concept in many ways. It's funny because we deployed $215 million, a lot more than this, right? But this is a somewhat different structure, and we want to be able to show how this works with a network that has the capacity to do a whole lot more, an already proven capacity to do a whole lot more. And we believe that this is absolutely scalable, but also it will be an important, I believe, a really important learning in the space about how do we go places with impact capital that we haven't gone before, both in terms of ethnic community and geography. There is always a concern that you go through the brain damage of a structured fund and the deals that you're planning on using have moved on. Well, certainly that's true. But we're aiming at markets rather than a specific neighborhood, for example. And so the deals I was seeing a year ago in South Texas look very much like the deals we're seeing right now today, right? I am, at this point in the game, literally seeing a new deal within the target markets we're talking about that is really actionable for this kind of capital facility every 3 weeks. I've got a tape on my desk right now from a single-family portfolio in Las Vegas. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that being dumped on the market by folks who took advantage of sort of Fannie, Freddie, or FHA deals. They made their money on them, and now they're sort of chopping them up and putting them back in the marketplace. Those are places where we'd love to be ready to catch. And I've described a little bit about what kinds of deals we're talking about. So let me stop there. My goal was to walk you through a specific structure, but aimed at sort of answering sort of the broader question about what are some of the challenges in the field and how are we trying to respond to them. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Noel. That was super helpful. Let's see if there are any questions from the participants about either the structure or how this matches up to the issues that that Margot brought up. I will note some of you I had to put on mute because there was some background noise. I will try to unmute everybody, and I will simply remute you if there is background noise. So go right ahead.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, this is Allison. I have a question about the levels of affordability and what you guys see as the opportunities or challenges with funding affordable housing for those kind of at the lowest income. So like in DC, I know, 80% AMI is you have to earn $85,000 $2,000 a year. And a lot of the affordable housing work and development done here is kind of leaves out those below 30% of the area median income, which here is like $32,000 a year for a family of 4. So this is for both presenters and anyone who has thoughts on this.
This is Noel. Absolutely. So a couple of ways of getting at that. One is that one of the best ways to get to very low income is to be able to structure in housing choice vouchers, either tenant-based or project-based. And these properties obviously are open to that. What we are showing is what the affordability of the actual, what the rent structure would be. Now, obviously, we have a range of connections to housing authorities that we could not necessarily sort of guarantee up front that's going to happen. But that's precisely the point, is to be able to leverage tenant-based subsidy in particular into what we're talking about. The other thing is that in the markets that we're working in, the area median income in a place like San Francisco, D.C., or New York is mixed upwards by a very, very high degree of wealth. 80% of AMI in McAllen, Texas, for example, is about $40,000 for a family of 4. In South Phoenix, that's about 50,000. And so that sort of range is certainly a range that we want to be able to target and be able to mix in deeper affordability with some of these subsidy mechanisms that are in the takeout, right? And whether it's takeout in terms of like a home buyer subsidy or a rental subsidy, that's a crucial opportunity.
Thanks.
Cool. Anyone else, or perhaps Margot? Do you have any thoughts now that that we've heard Noel's presentation on how some of this fits within the broader issues that you were highlighting before?
This is Morgan. I wanted to just ask a question. I understand that J.P. Morgan Chase and then Ford Foundation were instrumental in kind of funding the development, and then curious in terms of lead investors identified of who have been the investors so far and what are their primary motivations.
Yeah, so we are very much in the capital raise process right now. The guaranteed money that is in came from a sizable grant from the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, so 2.6 is already in. We are talking to a range of investors right now. I'm not going to use their names in vain because I wouldn't want to presume. As I think many of you know, the Ford Foundation's PRI program is actually sort of shut down right now, and more likely to crank up mid-year to late year. And I certainly hope that their investment in our effort to this point culminates in an investment in the fund. But again, I don't want to speak out of turn. But what I will say is that the balance of what we are raising is about 70% equity, about 30% PRI debt. And there's nothing magical about that balance, but that's what pencils out for sure. And we have gotten, I feel, a lot more interested and interesting feedback from family offices, from high net worth individuals, and some of the PRI conversations have been, more typical conversations about PRIs.
So this is Margot, and I'm just going to respond a little bit to the earlier question, Andrea, and piggyback on what Noel's talking through right now, which is the capital raise challenges. I think, broadly speaking, what we're seeing in the market in response to the shifts we're seeing at the community level and the availability of established funding programs that are subsidized through public sources is a shift from an era when you had institutions like foundations and governments saying, okay, we have an affordable housing program, and this is how it works, and this is what we fund, and this is where we fund it, and this is the kind of capital we put into it. To people who are operating with, both feet in a given market, saying, okay, here's where the capital gaps are. Let's try to structure a vehicle that meets those gaps, and then going out into the funder market and trying to raise the corresponding capital. And in that latter instance, it's a shift in the broader impact investment world. I think it's a good one, but we're definitely seeing a lot of growing pains through that general trend. And one is that foundations, which have a lot of the resources for the things like market studies and evaluation and impact analysis, are structurally really limited in their ability to step outside of their predefined programmatic boundaries. And so they are, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are hamstrung when it comes to being able to be responsive to this kind of market need. Speaking as an investor in the Keller Foundation side, one of the, odd unintended consequences too of this is a lot of unfunded commitments because of the shifting market dynamics where, you underwrite the de novo structured funds, you make a commitment, but it's going to take time. It's not an established program. Deploying those funds in an organic way, in a way that's responsive to the market, does take time. It's not one slug of capital and then you're done, especially if you're targeting smaller site development. So that's something to be cognizant of as an investor, is you need to be able to have that kind of patience and in a way, those carrying costs. And family offices are increasingly joining the impact investing movement, as many of you know. And what we've seen is that they have been, they complement the foundations really well, and that while they don't have necessarily in many cases the resources for that in-depth market research and that intellectual capital necessarily, they do have much more flexible approaches to what they can invest in and what kind of capital they're working with and where they can invest. So it's fun to hear what Noel's looking at in terms of his capital raise, because I'm very sympathetic to the challenge of being in this shifting landscape and trying to appeal to kind of multiple stakeholders that all have very different approaches and timelines and types of capital. And that is just the reality that we're seeing in the market more broadly as well.
Yeah, there's certainly challenge in it. I'll say that for us, there's a tremendous imperative because we have this network of organizations that has been tested, that really knows their markets and knows how to invest in these markets. But the connection to capital, sort of connective tissue between capital and those communities is not there, and certainly not near the scale that the market can absorb. And so that for us is a really important part of this whole endeavor, is not just to do something that I think makes good financial sense and is another good option out there for investors, but it really creates a new ability to target markets that are not being well served. I saw a question on the group chat just about sort of comparing and contrasting the deployment of the NSP capital, the dollars, the federal grant dollars I was talking about, the $215 million, and sort of how does that look like or not look like what we're proposing here. And I'll just answer real briefly that at the transaction level, it looks very, very similar. So same markets, same developers, same kinds of transactions and housing types. But obviously, federal grant money is different. And so it doesn't mean that you have to be, it doesn't mean that you can be any less diligent in how you manage and asset manage a deal. Because you can lose money using federal money just like you can using private dollars. But obviously, the finances of the structure and the expectations of what you're doing with it are somewhat different. The other thing is that the depth of affordability, given that we were working with grant dollars and there were mandates around that, were significant. significantly more. And it's worth pointing out that we are creating this as another sort of capital tool in the belts of organizations that have a variety of other ways of bringing leverage to the table and making communities, strengthening communities. And that's true for NALCAB as well. We see this as a very important tool and one that can grow into becoming a very large tool for us. But this is not the sum of our strategy in terms of supporting our organizations or investing in our communities. We have a grant program. We provide technical assistance and leadership development to these groups and what have you off of our 501c3 platform. And it's the integration of the capital tool with those sort of more targeted, sort of social impact tools that we think also provide some real opportunity to sort of guarantee impact in a space where there's a lot of question about whether impact is being achieved through various investment mechanisms.
Hi, Noel. This is Anair. Thanks for the presentation. You referenced a couple of ways where you were addressing an underserved need or a gap in the market, and I was kind of trying to put a finer point on it a little bit in terms of to what extent is it that these are just regions and communities? You mentioned just the states and the regions in the Southwest that just aren't getting as much of these investment dollars. So to what extent is it just that the regions are not being reached by existing strategies versus more of sort of the approach and the how? So perhaps there are projects being financed in these communities, in these regions, but some of the governance and some of your approach and working with the local developers is where you see kind of the real difference making.
Absolutely, and I would say there's a little bit of a mix of both. There's for example, Metro Denver, right? No shortage of opportunity to access capital. We saw a great example here. But once you leave Metro Denver and you go to rural Colorado, more challenging. And then when you go to predominantly Latino and what are sort of second-generation farm worker communities in rural Colorado, less yet. And then you ask who is actually deploying capital into housing that serves that community, you're down to a list of a very small number of organizations that really have capacity to do that. Similarly, a place like South Texas, right? And the opportunity in southern Chicago, I think is much more what you were referring to, which is that there's all kinds of investment going on in Chicago, but with the Resurrection Project, for example, our partner there, which has been turned into a really successful developer, but it does this whole range of other things to strengthen the community. There is this opportunity to make housing part of a strategy. And traditionally, there's been some challenge out there with affordable housing developers sort of developing to the deal as opposed to the community, right? And these organizations, these developers, which now have very strong developer credentials, are first and foremost community-based organizations in terms of their own thinking about themselves. And that doesn't mean that they don't know how to develop housing in very strong ways, but it speaks to their reason, their motivation in the investment, and oftentimes gets down to affecting the actual design of deals because they're thinking with that lens. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks. That's helpful.
Great. Let's see. We have a few more minutes to wrap this up. I was wondering, Martha, if you're still on the webinar. There's Martha from the CETA Enablement Fund. The conversations that you and I had a while back were very pivotal for some of our thinking around this. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what Margot and Noel just presented. Anyone else, meanwhile? No?
Well, just to say this has been great and really interesting, and thanks so much to the both of you for your time and preparation.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Yep. This has been great, and we have there the contact information for Noel and Margot. Please feel free to follow up with them as well as with us at Transform Finance. This is definitely an ongoing topic and conversation for us, and there's plenty still to be done as we try to see really how to crack this nut of affordable housing in a way that really does benefit communities. Please, oh, and I see there might be one more thing coming up. Oh no, that was just a word of thank you. Great, well, thank you to both Margot and Noel. Thank you to all that participated. The next webinar will be, let me look it up quickly, I'm sorry, will be on May 20th. It's also a Wednesday at the same time. I will send out an invite shortly as we are confirming some of the speakers on that. Look forward to that, and thank you everybody who attended today, and especially Noel and Margot.
Thank you, Andrea.
All right, take care everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.